And thank you for joining Battleground, Florida. I am Christopher Heath, coming to you from the Parish Healthcare Podcast Studio here in beautiful Orlando, Florida. Today's guest is Noah Rothman. He is the associate editor of Commentary Magazine, and we're discussing social justice and a new strain of social justice that has emerged on the right, articulated most recently by Florida Senator Marco Rubio in a speech he gave, and then an article written by Noah Rothman. We discussed the article by Noah Rothman, the speech by Senator Rubio, and what exactly social justice means for the right. Here is my conversation with Commentary Magazine associate editor Noah Rothman. All right, Noah, thank you for joining us. The piece you wrote is Social Justice, Republican Style. It is kind of going at what Marco Rubio said in his speech, and his speech was Catholic Social Doctrine and the Dignity of Work. He gave this speech at the Catholic University of America, and you took issue with several parts of it. I'll let you explain the basic thesis of what you read into what he said and your interpretation of what he said.
Sure. So I wrote a book on social justice, and the themes that I heard expressed in the senator's speech and in the documents that were presented as in support of the speech were very familiar to a certain brand of social justice, which is popular among the right, which is divorced from the identity aspects of it. There's a certain strain of social justice thinking, which is popular on the left, less popular but not alien to the right, which identifies identity, accidents of birth, immutable traits as being sort of the center of their ideology, but there's an economic component as well. And the senator, I believe, Senator Rubio, expressed those beliefs rather succinctly in his presentation of a form of economic social organization, real broad themes, not really programmatic themes per se, but broad overarching themes, which harken back to the origins of Catholic social teaching, and specifically his citation of the Pope Leo XIII's encyclical in 1891, the Rerum Novarum, which was very much informed by anti-Enlightenment thought. So real brief, going back into history, the Enlightenment, as we understand it, the Scottish and English versions, which very much informed the founders' ideals, were not necessarily the sort of thing that the Catholic Church was predisposed to support. The Catholic Church had a very different experience with the Enlightenment in France. They were much more hostile to it, with good reason, by the way. And so in an effort to create an alternative theory of social organization that didn't privilege the notion of some sort of Adam Smith-style invisible hands, that individual prosperity was not necessarily the result of personal activity, the pursuit of personal advantage, that was hostile towards the Catholic Church's teaching. So Jesuit thinkers like Luigi Teporelli created this alternative theory of social organization, which they called social justice, used the term social justice in a way that is commensurate with its current definition. And it was much more of a way to think about charity, but at the same time, it was an anti-Enlightenment ideal, and it stipulated also sort of the rudiments of what we now call the welfare state. It was designed to ameliorate and mollify the demands from below for socialism. So it expressed some support for property rights and the like, but also that the state needs to intervene in economic activities in a much more robust way than it had previously. It was an intellectual foundation for the progressive era at a time when the progressive era was had goals that were much grander than they are today, but and important. But nevertheless, it was an articulation of a sort of less laissez-faire style approach to markets and government, and that has certainly informed the senator's view. And it is one that I think is hostile towards the kind of libertarian economics that have previously typified the Republican economic program, from Goldwater to Reagan to George W. Bush. And now we are beginning to see a Republican Party turn against those prescriptions and advance a much more activist, progressive idea of how a society should be structured, how it should structure its economics. And I find that profoundly deleterious, in part because they don't work. They have not worked. And they create profound distortions in the economy and promote political dysfunction along the way.
What will you do? What Rubio says, though, in his remarks, and to read them, he says, what we need to do is restore common good capitalism, a system of free enterprise in which workers fulfill their obligation to work and enjoy the benefits of their work. He's articulating what I think, if to be less charitable, you would say is a platitude, but at the same time, he's hitting on something that is fundamental. Workers need to feel valued for the work they do. If I am to read both what he says and what you wrote, it seems as if he's identifying the problem, but the prescription may not be exactly what is needed.
Yeah, I mean, who could argue with that, right? I mean, who would honestly take issue with that? It's not something that anybody would say. Well, anybody with a rational view of how to organize society and an economic model would say, "Oh, we can't have that." The problem is it's sort of a paradigmatic misconception of how capitalism markets work. The common good capitalism is capitalism. Markets are their own virtue, in part because they achieve that which societal engineers hope to achieve, without all the moral ambiguities and, in fact, compromises that have to be made along the way when public policy decides to choose winners and losers. When winners and losers are a product of any economic system, that is a natural outgrowth of economic systems. Nevertheless, there are far more moral compromises when an individual is pushing the button on somebody as opposed to market forces, which are much more diffuse and harder to identify as being the product of somebody's individual desire. That's when you can identify an individual who's behind your conditions, your circumstances, as opposed to forces beyond your control. Then you create the kind of animosities that persist over the course of generations, and also create the kind of moiety among populations, the distinctions and the separations among populations that foster animosity and frustration and hostility and result in, again, dysfunctional politics. And I think the senator acknowledges this because over the course of his speech, much of which was unobjectionable, but some of which ideologically, I think, off base to achieve what he wants to achieve, he then comes around to our major competitor in the 21st century, China, which has adopted an illiberal, anti-enlightenment model. And so he recommends to combat that model, more liberal, more anti-enlightenment thought. It's just rather confused, in my view. And also, the prescriptions that he recommends over the course of the speech, tinkering with the margins of the tax code for more child tax benefits, and intervention in the sphere of trade. I mean, these are sort of piddling prescriptions for what he seems to contend here is an existential threat to the current social compact. It was just, in my view, a little discordant.
But if the question is, how do you compete with the growing power that is China, do we do that by saying, okay, here's what they're doing, we need to try and play by the same rules? Or do we say, no, the rules we have played by for 200 years have gotten us where we are. We are doing just fine. They will eventually discover the folly of their own ways.
Well, take for example, and just to put this in a much more pragmatic or substantive space that's not theoretical, we do currently have a very serious problem with American firms, individual American firms, catering to the illiberal ideals of Beijing and stifling the free flow of information and refusing to support democratic activists in Hong Kong, for example, for fear of fear of being shut out of access to the Chinese market. And that might seem like a market failure, and in some ways it is. But the prescription for that cannot be simply more market failure. We're talking about two distinct markets here. One is an economic and one is ideological. In the marketplace of ideas, China cannot compete, which is why it seeks so desperately to distort that marketplace, to shut it down. Part of the reason we have firms that are catering to that. But the idea here is not to simply compete on that level and engage in our own distortions and our own efforts to shut down the free flow and conduct of ideas in order to compete that. And you cannot defeat that which you have become. And so, and part of this is thinking about markets in a way that I think is just a misconception, is that these are competitive spheres, and in order to defeat your competition, you have to compete. You cannot simply disengage from that competition. And I think that's what public policy here along the lines of what Marco Rubio seeks to do, is conceding that ultimately we are being defeated by our own ideals. And I just think that's a fundamental misapprehension of how markets work, of how capitalism functions, of the benefits of a free marketplace. But it is probably the most important debate ongoing now on the right. And it has a lot less to do with being competitive in the marketplace economically than it does in preserving the soul and creating a condition for human flourishing in the spaces that exist outside economic life. Part of my problem with that prescription is that an expanding public sector crowds out all those institutions that create the communitarian bonds that national conservatives privilege above economic activity. The activist organizations, community centers, churches, schools, public life that exists outside the economic realm are crowded out of existence or subordinated to the public sector when it engages in that kind of the kind of conduct that I think national conservatives would like to see it conduct. And these things are not incompatible with the libertarian economic prescription. In fact, they exist, they flourish in a condition in which libertarian economic prescriptions are applied and individuals are free to pursue their own self-interest. The precise opposite occurs when the public sector assumes the mantle of private charity.
But isn't this partially also what we're seeing from Marco Rubio and some of the same ilk going out and now trying to take a measure of the landscape and saying, okay, you have obviously the left, which has no problem in moving forward with having the government take a larger role in some of these realms. But you've also seen the current administration, the Trump administration, pull these various levers that used to not be something that the GOP or conservatives would go for. And is this the landscape where you have both sides now more than willing to use the power of government to achieve results, damned to be the consequences?
Yeah, and this is ultimately where I think that the senator is being animated by a desire to get in front of a wave of public sentiment. The Republican coalition has been changing over the course of a decade. It is much less geared towards the financial elite and people with degrees, and much more towards working class voters of all races and classes, but mostly working class. And they are much more economically populist as a class. They're far less hostile towards public sector intervention in private life. And I think that has informed the senator, who is one of the fiercest free market advocates in the 2016 field, who has now decided that the excesses of the private sector must be tampered down by a much more activist government. I don't think he's had a road to Damascus moment here. I think he's discovered that this is where the politics of the moment are leading him. And I think that's a flawed view of how to conduct political life, but it is the senator's prerogative to do so. But nevertheless, I don't believe that it is a desirous economic model, and it's not going to be something that the working class will embrace unless somebody advocates for the virtues of a free market system of not unfettered and untamed markets, but the power of commerce and of individuals pursuing their own self-interest and therefore contributing to the public good. This is the sort of thing that needs to be taught and learned, because it is not intuitive. It is nevertheless accurate and right and proven so over the course of 2 centuries. And it is incumbent on our political class to make that case. And when they don't make that case, we don't have a political economy that understands how markets work.
There is also, too, to read over the senator's remarks, he does talk about interacting with people who got left behind. Or he says in there, he says, when I ran for president, I learned the hard way that many Americans did not share my optimism. They were anxious, even angry at those they blamed for ignoring them, disrespecting them, and leaving them behind. He goes on to talk about cabinet makers in Georgia, workers in Pennsylvania, people whose lives were turned upside down when companies exercise their right to make a profit by offshoring their jobs with little regard for their corresponding duty to invest in their own workers. So he's drawing on a personal experience from the 2015-2016, his bid to be president, and saying we need to do something about this, which gets back to what I asked earlier, which is, what is the prescription? What levers are you going to pull to to take care of this, because the system we currently have is what got us to this.
Yeah, I mean, let's just take a look at the manufacturing sector right now, right? So productivity is doing extremely well, but the manufacturing sector in this country has entered into a recessionary phase for two reasons. One, the labor market is extremely tight. We have full employment right now. So labor is very expensive, and it can't compete with labor abroad. The prescription that some would entertain for that is to simply make labor in this country less expensive with increased immigration. Others would entertain the prospect of shutting out competition abroad and distorting market prices by protecting domestic industry. Both of these are pluses and minuses, but you have to understand where that is coming from. Where the senator, I think, is right, and which contradicts his own argument, is that quite a bit of the tax code now creates disincentives to engage in long-term capital investment, and also the president's own trade policies create a lot of confusion and fear about where the market is going to be in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. So companies are disinclined to make those kind of capital investments. And we understand the benefits of capital investments, long-term capital investments, not because they benefit workers. That's not their point. The point is to create the conditions where businesses can grow in the long term. Ultimately, that benefits workers because it creates more opportunities for employment, and the people who are employed therefore use that capital that they gain from employment to support other industries, and the people they support other industries, and so on and so forth. That's how markets work. If you think that you have to compel businesses to invest in decisions and to make investments in their own futures that they don't necessarily need, based on an assumption of what their own objectives are, you're going to create a distorted marketplace that won't have those benefits. It may benefit a few, but this is something that is being dictated from the top down, so it is not going to have the maximum benefits allocated by a perfect allocation of resources by people who are close enough to the ground to know what those are. The fact is that Washington cannot make those decisions. It's simply not close enough to the ground. Regulatory agencies cannot make those decisions because they're not close enough to the ground. That's why they're prone to, quote, capture by the regulated industries that they oversee. So while nobody's making a three cheers for capitalism argument here, that a regulated marketplace is by definition a two cheers argument, it is nevertheless the case that the senator has misrepresented what I believe are the core benefits of the market system, which is individual choices on the maximally individual level, the lowest possible level, close enough to the ground to understand individual communities and to respond to those communities' needs. That cannot be done from the top. And that's the choice that progressives make, that liberals make, and it is just a terrible shame to see conservatives embrace that sort of 30,000-foot perspective of social engineering, because it has only routinely, consistently failed. And we do not need two parties in this country with the same view of markets.
No, and to that end, I mean, you go and you look at what we have seen in the last 2 years, 2.5 years, with the government taking certain steps to protect specific industries, steel and coal being among them, because these are obviously places where there's a political capital there that you say, okay, we need to get these people engaged, but the market decides for itself whether or not this is going to happen. And we've seen the effects of steel tariffs. We've seen the effects of trying to open up coal markets, and they've not produced the results that were necessarily intended. In many cases, produced much worse unintended results, which speaks, I guess, to your point of if the government starts to put its thumb on the scale, you don't exactly know what the ripple effects will be.
Yeah, and I mean, so this is another thing that I've written about on a couple of different occasions. Just take coal as an individual example. You know, one of the bugaboos of the progressive left is the environmental impact of dirty coal, even cleaner coal burning for power generation. But one of the miracles of this decade has been a revolution in petroleum extraction and engineering that allows us to extract natural gases from sources that were otherwise prohibitively costly. And so we've seen a revolution in this country in energy production and a simultaneous revolution in the reduction of carbon emissions from power generation. We're currently at 1985 levels of CO2 emissions as a result of power generation, all because of natural gas. And that didn't have results from some edict on high, a bureaucrat, determined fracking should spring fully formed from his forehead. This was the result of markets and capital markets and investment, long-term financing from the kind of people that Tucker Carlson calls, profiteers. disreputable vultures. This is how innovation happens in this country, and it has contributed rather to the kind of labor market that we currently have, in which almost everybody is employed. There are a lot of terrible stories about individuals who are displaced in this condition. They are very real, they are heart-wrenching, and they deserve our sympathy. But in the aggregate, more people are benefiting. And in a policymaker's view, you have to think in terms of who benefits most from a particular condition. Now, there's no condition that everybody will benefit from. It is maximum benefit for the most people. And in terms of, when you just look at coal production, the benefits that we see from fracking generation, gas generation, outweigh the costs associated with making coal so costly to produce that it is no longer efficient. Some people will lose their jobs in that situation, yes, but more people will benefit.
One of the things I covered early on in my career in Central Texas, when I was working there was a plan to bring in about 3 coal-burning power plants. This is before fracking really came into a robust sense. And what you saw these large swaths of especially rural voters, farmers and ranchers in Central Texas show up, and they were protesting, they were angry, and they were saying, no, you will not be building these coal plants in our area. You will not be putting this in our area. And they weren't doing it because of an ideological bent. They weren't doing it because they were aligned with one party or the other. They were doing it because they did not want those coal plants in their area. And what happened is the coal plants never got built. So you did have that pushback from the ground, and essentially what happened is the market took care of itself. There was not a need to come in and say, we won't build no more coal plants. People said, we don't want these built.
Yeah. And I mean, I understand the president's impulse to freeze American conditions in place, particularly those that benefit his core constituents. But that distortion in the marketplace creates political dysfunction because these conditions cannot last forever. We simply cannot freeze the conditions that prevail today in place in perpetuity. And to promise a constituency that is a promise that will be broken. And when the promise is broken, you will have a lot of people who are real mad, and they won't know who to be mad at. And so they'll take out their frustration on the political system in general, and perceive themselves to be displaced and unloved and unliked even by Washington. And these are the conditions that I think the senator is seeking to address. And he has rightly diagnosed the problem, but I don't think he's correctly diagnosed the cause.
He also puts out a couple of ideas here, and I want to tick them off pretty quick. One of the things he says is that instead tax preference should be for the use of corporate profits that further the common good by creating new jobs and higher wages. This is after he talks about how stock buybacks should not be illegal, but he does start to talk about the tax code. So he starts to delve into what are some of the levers of government. What do you make of that?
Yeah, so I don't really have a lot of problem with any of that. I mean, if you want to create inducements in the tax code to compel businesses to make more long-term capital investments, which make more sense than retaining that capital and offering it back to their shareholders, I mean, that's sort of small beer for what we're talking about, right? I mean, the senator rather is talking about a sort of societal devolution, which is creating this mass of disaffected Americans who will take their anger out on the political system and represent a threat to the very democracy, institutions and levers of democracy that we hold dear. And the prescription for that is to create incentives on the tax code level to invest in what, another factory somewhere along the lines, or maybe another office. I mean, I just don't understand exactly where the senator thinks that this is the prescription for the problem he's identifying. There's really nothing objectionable about tinkering with the tax code and creating more incentives to have children, for example, and to make long-term investments and to give companies back more of their funds in order for them to expand into other sectors, expand abroad. All of that is good, I think, economically. It's also just disproportionate to the scale of the problem that he seems to be addressing, which is part of the reason why I found this just addressed so contradictory on its face. I mean, he's talking about these grand realignments of American ideological positioning, and understanding of their founding ideals and understanding of how the marketplace works, and then prescribes these rather piddling efforts to address them, which betrays, I think, sort of the smallness in his mind of the problem that he's getting at. And ultimately, he notes that we're in an effort to combat an ideological threat, not unlike that which we combated in the Soviet Union, although of a different kind, in the form of communist China, which is wholly anti-Enlightenment, wholly illiberal, and takes a dim view of the marketplace. And the idea here is to compete and beat them, right? So how do you do that? By adopting a lot of their prescriptions. I mean, it just simply it simply isn't coherent, and that's part of the problem with social justice generally, that it is not an especially coherent view. It takes going all the way back to the thought of John Rawls, pretty much the founder of the modern thinking along social justice lines, as he created a series of constructs for us to think about justice as a finite commodity that has to be distributed by enlightened bureaucrats who are empowered to distribute the benefits of society as justly as they possibly can. And he created constructs for us to see how that would be done, like the veil of ignorance. So this enlightened operator would operate from behind a veil of ignorance, so he wouldn't understand who the beneficiaries of this distribution are. Very highfalutin philosophical concepts. But when John Rawls' theory met some obstacles in the form of real world, problems where individuals maybe benefit too much or the wrong people benefit from the social justice distribution that he had envisioned, the veil of ignorance goes right out the window. He abandons that himself in his own philosophy in order to achieve the kind of objectives he would like to see achieved. And that is part of the problem with just social justice thinking in general. It is not a dogma. It adapts based on the circumstances that it is confronted with in order to reward the right people with the right stuff. And that's pretty much the progressive ideal. And that's why I think it's so dangerous to see conservatives and Republicans adopt it, because it is an effort to reward individual constituencies while wrapping itself in the banner of this, glorious society and wholly neutral view of the beneficiaries of their policies. It is not neutral. It is absolutely an effort to create constituency maintenance and to dole out the benefits of society in ways that are advantageous to the people they want to advantage. And that, to me, is unjust.
One of the other things that the senator puts out is he says he wants to reform the Small Business Administration, saying he wants to see that it channels finance into small business manufacturers instead of lifeless corporate conglomerates. And he references, of course, he says, we will invigorate the legacy of business innovation that delivered Americans to the moon 50 years ago. He says that basically 3 sentences after he says the goal isn't to recreate the economy of 1969. Again, it does feel like you're trying to have it both ways.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree. And reforming the Small Business Administration is probably a good idea. I mean, again, we're not taking issue with a lot of the individual prescriptions here that the senator adopts. We're taking issue, I think, with a paradigmatic approach to what he thinks should be the ideal, which is this Catholic doctrine-infused economics, which takes a much more public view of private charity. And it is an idea that has been limited to the progressive left for at least a generation, probably 2 generations, but no more than that. The Republican Party was home to the progressive idea throughout the first half of the 20th century. And it may be once again, and it may be electorally successful. And if that's your only objective, winning elections, then maybe this is the right way to go. I don't think it's good policy. I think it is morally compromising, and ultimately will create more political dysfunction than it is worth. And that shouldn't be the objective of the policymaker to think in such short-term, in parochial ways. And that's part of the reason why I took issue with the senator's speech.
In wrapping this up, you did at the very end, I think, really succinctly put this to a very fine point on this. And it was essentially, is the choice going to be, I'm not going to read directly from your own work here, but going protectionist as a way of fighting off the impulse of socialism. And that does seem like a devil's choice.
Yeah, and also, I mean, in 1891, when the Rerum Novarum was delivered, socialism was a real threat. And it was growing in popularity. In their lifetime, there had been a series of violent revolutions, and there would be more to come in their lifetimes, all of which were an effort to reorient the economy away from a completely laissez-faire conception of it and create a sort of series of charitable works and backstops that would result in what we now call the welfare state. All that was valuable and important at the turn of the last century. Today, socialism's appeal is vastly overrated by the media. You really have to go into the polls to look at where the support for this sort of thing is. I cited in that piece an Axios-sponsored poll, and you go into the demos, and it finds that socialism is much more popular than you think it would be. A scary amount of people think it's popular. But you go into the demographics and break down the individual demographics, and where it is popular among a majority is limited to women under the age of 45. And that's it. Not popular with a majority among even young people. Working class voters, I think it broke down 50-50, and even young people broadly of all demos didn't view this as a majority proposition. So to suggest that we're in a space today where socialism is as much of a popular threat as it was at the turn of the 20th century is just frankly unsupported by any data. It is a media narrative. You have very high profile people in Congress for whom this is a big deal, and they amount to three, I think, maybe 4 out of 500 some odd people. It is an over-exaggeration of the scale of the threat. And in order to address this threat, and it is a threat, but it is one that we need to keep in perspective. And cutting off our nose in the process doesn't seem to me like a very valuable course of action.
And this definitely feels like a debate we will hear a lot more of as we look out at a political landscape that has been reoriented and to a certain extent turned a little bit after the last couple of years, and we try and make sense of where do we go next and what will be the defining issues for both the two major political parties going forward.
Yeah, I mean, this is the most interesting intellectual current on the right today, and part of the reason why I think this is brief digression. When the Republican Party, or rather your party, is in power, is when your party has the White House, what your daily conversation is about in past administrations is about what this week's legislative push is going to be. All hands on deck for the transportation bill. And everybody talks about this for a week. You have every surrogates all over cable news trumping up support for the transportation bill. We don't have that agenda in the Trump administration. We're rudderless. And so the Republican Party and the conservative coalition are debating first principles on the ground, the kind of things that happen to you when you're out of power. These ideological realignments occur when you have no power, when you have no authority, and you're rebuilding a coalition. That's happening to the right now, while they are in power, which suggests to me that the Trump era is much more transient than a lot of us think it is. You know, on its face, superficially, the Republican Party is completely united behind Donald Trump and his vision for the country. On the ground, it ain't that. And so when this president passes from the political stage, these debates are going to take much rise to the fore and much more in a way than they have already. And they're going to be much more schismatic than they are right now. And so engaging in this debate now is very important. It's very stimulating. And I think the senators should be applauded for engaging in the debate. I just think he got the answers wrong.
No, and it's important to do the heavy lifting and the deep thinking now, because if we wait until 2020 or 2024, depending on when President Trump's time in office comes to an end, we may have missed the moment. Okay, Noah, we'll link to your piece as well as the senator's remarks. If people want to follow you, find out what you're up to, where can they track you down at?
You can read me at commentarymagazine.com. or in the magazine, which is a print subscription at Commentary Magazine, or you can find me on Twitter at Noah C. Rothman.
Noah, I appreciate the time. Thank you very much. I will try and reach out to you again because, man, I never thought I would actually be doing an entire piece on the writings of Pope Leo XIII, but here we are.
Thank you, sir. It's been a pleasure.
And I want to thank Noah for his time. I will put a link in the show notes both to the speech by Senator Marco Rubio as well as the piece written by Noah Rothman. If you'd like to read that further, that will be down in the show notes. I'd like to say thank you to everybody who has taken the time to download these episodes and reach out. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter or get in touch, you can do that pretty easy, at Heath, WFTV, or you can, of course, reach out via email, christopher.heath@WFTV. We'll try and get another couple shows in your feed starting next week. We obviously have the November Democratic debate in Atlanta coming up, so we'll probably talk about that. And, oh, by the way, there is now open impeachment inquiries going on in D.C., so maybe we'll get around to discussing what that all means. But for now, we are going to be moving on, and I will talk to you again. Thank you very much for listening. I'll talk to you again.